Now Al-Akhdari is going to go on to talk about some issues of fiqh, which we call masail. They're issues of fiqh that are related to purifying oneself. And the first issue that he talks about is removing an impurity from the body. Now, removing an impurity from one's clothing. If one is removing an impurity from one's clothing, we can separate that impurity into two categories. Either that impurity is visible, or that impurity is not is visible. Again, either that purity is invisible or it's visible, meaning that you can see the impurity or you can't see the impurity. If you can see the impurity, all you have to do is wash the area where the impurity is. So if you can see the impurity, like for example a urine stain and it's yellow, and you can see it and it's visual, all you have to do is remove that impurity in order for the thobe to be pure so that you can pray in it. If the impurity is invisible, meaning that you can't see it, for example, maybe a baby urinated on your clothing when the baby was on your lap, and then you changed your thobe, and then you went and picked up the thobe 10 or 15 minutes later and the area was dry and you couldn't find it. Here you're requested to wash the whole entire thobe, as Al-Akhdari mentions. But when you get into more advanced books, what Al-Akhdari, according to Maliki Fiqh, and what is between the lines of what Al-Akhdari is mentioning, that a person has to wash the complete area in which he has doubt in. For example, if you know that the urine dropped on the sleeve, then we have to wash the whole sleeve so that there's no doubt that we remove the impurity. Or for example, we know that the impurity is on the bottom half of the thobe, and we're sure that if we wash the bottom half of the thobe, then that means we have removed the impurity. Then this is what we mean by washing the whole thobe. In the text here, literal translation, Al-Akhdari says that if the impurity is visible, then you have to wash the whole entire thobe. But what it means when we go into detail, it means that a person has to wash the whole part of the thobe until there's no doubt that he has removed the impurity, as examples that we mentioned previously. So that's the first issue of fiqh that Al-Akhdari mentions when he says إِذَا تَعَيْنَتِ النَّجَاسَةُ if the impurity is visible, غُسِلَ مَحَلُّهَا, then just wash the spot. فَإِنِ الْتَبَسَتْ if it is invisible, غُسِلَ الثَّوْبُ كُلُّهُ, then the whole thobe is to be washed. And what we said, the meaning of that is the whole thobe in which one has the whole thobe has to be washed, not literally, but enough that one is sure that the impurity has been removed. The next issue that Al-Akhdari talks about is وَمَنْ شَكَّ فِي إِصَابَةِ النَّجَاسَةِ نَدَحَ وَإِنْ أَصَابَهُ شَيْءٌ شَكَّ فِي نَجَاسَتِهِ فَلَا نَدْحَ عَلَيْهِ. Here, what Al-Akhdari is talking about is a person who's certain that an impurity is present. For example, they're certain that an impurity is present, but they have doubt on whether or not that impurity has come in contact with them. For example, you're walking down an alleyway and you know that the puddles that are there are mixed with urine, and you have no doubt about it because you can smell it and you can see impurities in the water. And then a car drives by and splashes and you jump back. Now you're not sure now you're certain that there's an impurity present, but you're unsure. Did the water come in contact with me? Did it touch the bottom of my thobe? Did it come in contact with my shoes? Yes or no? In this issue of fiqh, you're only requested to sprinkle water in the area in which you have doubt, and you're not requested to wash the area where you think that an impurity might have come in contact with you. Here, the Sharia gives a rukhsah, gives a dispensation, and says instead of washing it all all you have to do is sprinkle. And the hikmah and the wisdom behind sprinkling is because in general, in the Maliki madhab, it is not permissible for a person to pray with doubt. So if we were to follow the original usul of the madhab, it would say, since you have doubt whether or not your thobe is pure, then you have to wash all of it. But because there's difficulty in that, then the Sharia allows here for a dispensation, and the rule in the Maliki madhab is all you have to do is just sprinkle water in the area where you think there's doubt, and then don't follow that doubt. Your thobe is pure, your shoes are pure, and you can go and pray. And that's the meaning of Al-Akhdari when he says, وَمَنْ شَكَّ فِي إِصَابَةِ النَّجَاسَةِ نَدَحَا. Whoever doubts whether or not he's been an impurity has come in contact with him, fi isabati najasati nadaha, then all he has to do is sprinkle, and that sprinkle is obligatory. You just have to take a little bit of water and just flick it on the area, but that is obligatory. Now we have the opposite issue. Right now you're certain that something has the next issue, which is related, which is the opposite. You know that something has come in contact with you. You're certain about that, but you have doubt whether it's pure or impure. In this case, you're not requested to do anything. Why? Because in the Sharia, everything is pure until you have a reason to believe that it's impure. So, for example, you're walking down the street and water falls on your shoulder, and you start looking at the water, and you look up, for example, and you see a bunch of kids laughing. So you assume that it's an impurity, but in order for it to be impure according to Sharia, we said it either change in taste, smell, or taste, smell, or color. So if you were to see that water and that water did not change in its attribute, or there's no smell of impurity, then we're going to consider that water pure, and we're not even going to pay attention with it. We're not going to pay attention to it. If a person wants to wash it, then that's his prerogative. But in terms of praying in that thobe, there's no problem with praying in that thobe, because the rule is everything is considered pure. Water is considered pure until you have a reason to believe that it's impure. So that's the meaning of Al-Akhdari when he says, وَإِنْ أَصَابَهُ شَيْءٌ. If something comes in contact with him, شَكَّ فِي نَجَاسَتِهِ, that he's unsure whether or not it's an impurity, فَلَا نَدْحَ عَلَيْهِ, then it's not obligatory for him to sprinkle. In fact, it's not necessary for him to do anything. So in the first issue of fiqh that we mentioned, when a person is certain that there's an impurity, then and he has doubt whether it came in contact with him, then he just has to sprinkle over that area and then go about his business. And according to this one that we mentioned, where the opposite, where he's certain that something came in contact, but he's not sure whether or not there's an impurity. Whether or not it's impurity, he's not obligated to sprinkle anything, and it's permissible for him to pray in that thobe without any problem. The next issue that Al-Akhdari mentions is tied to, or the next two issues that he mentions is tied to a person who is praying. And this issue is what is related to a person. What does he do if he remembers an impurity while he's in his prayer? So if a person is in his prayer and he remembers that, oh no, I have an impurity on my clothing, either he's going to be requested to continue his prayer, or he's going to be requested not to. He's going to be requested to continue his prayer, or to discontinue it and change his thobe or remove the impurity. If he has the time, meaning that he has enough time to remove that impurity, or to change his thobe, or to find another thobe, then he's requested, it's obligatory for him to cut his prayer and go and change or remove that impurity. But if he fears that if I were to, for example, his next thobe is in the washing machine and he doesn't have any other clothing to wear. If he thought that if he was to cut his prayer and then wait to find another thobe that the time for prayer would go out, then he's obligated to continue. So the only time you're going to cut your prayer if you begin praying and you find an impurity is if you know that you can either find a new thobe or remove that impurity, or find any type of clothing that doesn't have an impurity before the prayer time goes out. Because as we mentioned before, that in terms of purification, we don't delay prayer. So for example, if a person is between either delaying his prayer or removing an impurity, we say no, don't delay your prayer, pray with the impurity. So that's the first issue. Al-Akhdari mentions, وَمَنْ تَذَكَّرَ النَّجَاسُ, whoever remembers that an impurity, وَهُوَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ, and he's in prayer, قَطَعَ, then he should cut his prayer, except أَنْ يَخَافَ خُرُوجَ الْوَقْتِ, except if he fears. The word fear here is the literal translation, but in the Sharia it means to think. If a person thinks, meaning 50-50, if a person has a 50-50 thought that if he was to cut his prayer, then the time for the prayer would exit. And the time that we're talking about here is the waqt al-mukhtar, the prayer time that is called al-mukhtar, as we will cover later on in the chapter of prayer times. So that's the issue of remembering an impurity while you're in prayer. Now, the second issue that Al-Akhdari is going to mention is remembering an impurity after you already said your salam. So for example, you're praying in your prayer and then you remember that, then you say assalamu alaikum and you finish your prayer, and then you remember that you have an impurity. Your prayer is still sound, but it is mustahab, meaning that it is virtuous to make it up as long as the prayer time still exists. And the prayer time that we're talking about is the time of the mukhtar. So if you say assalamu alaikum with an impurity, and then remember that you have an impurity, your prayer is perfectly fine. The only thing that you're requested to do is to repeat your prayer as long as the prayer time still exists. So if you remember that you had an impurity but the prayer time of mukhtar already went out, then you're no longer allowed to repeat your prayer, and your prayer is perfectly fine without any problem. Here, there's something that Al-Akhdari is telling you indirectly. And make sure that you make a fine note of this, because this is what Al-Akhdari is given an example of. Basically, what he's trying to tell you in these two examples is that removing an impurity is obligatory under two conditions. The first condition is that a person remembers, and the second condition is that a person has the ability. So what do we mean by remember? As long as the person remembers that he has an impurity before his prayer is done, then it's obligatory for him to remove that impurity if he has the ability. What is the meaning of ability? The meaning of ability is that he has the ability to remove that impurity before the prayer time goes out. Again, ability means that he has the ability to remove that impurity and pray before the prayer time goes out. So, removing impurities for the sake of prayer is under two conditions: if a person remembers to remove them, and if a person has the ability to remove them. If I don't remember, this is the example of a person who says assalamu alaikum after prayer. This is an example of a person who says assalamu alaikum and then remembers. While he was praying, he didn't remember. So we'll say that removing the impurity wasn't obligatory on him. And for example, a person who feared that if he were to leave his prayer, then that would cause him to pray outside of the prayer time, then we're going to say that removing an impurity is not obligatory because he doesn't have the ability to remove it before the prayer time goes out.